Welcome to the Heartful Parent Podcast. I'm your host, Christy Keating. In this podcast, we talk about it all, our parenting, our partnering, and our professional lives, because they are all a part of us, and we were never meant to do this alone. Hey there, Heartful Parent Podcast listeners. We are back for another episode of the pod, and I'm really excited about this one. It's a little bit of a different angle than we've taken in previous episodes because it's not so much about parenting itself, but as some of the things that we do as parents. Let me explain. The guest today is this really interesting woman named Dr. Samantha Radford. And Samantha is a chemistry professor turned blogger who focuses on non-toxic living and breastfeeding. She's obsessed with combining science and wellness to help moms and kids thrive at her site, Evidence-Based Mommy. Samantha also hosts Breastfeeding Beyond Babyhood, which is an annual online event designed to support and celebrate those who choose to nurse beyond the first year. In this conversation, we dig into some of the really big categories of things or places in our lives where our kids and us might be exposed to toxic chemicals. And she explains why toxins or chemicals are more dangerous in kids. And she gives some really practical advice about how we can shift some of those things around, even if you are on a budget. And she also really shares and sort of promotes the idea that, look, you do what you can and you let the rest go, which I so appreciate about this conversation. So we dig into all of this and she's got some great information. And then at the end, stay tuned for the final question that I ask her, because it struck me as we were chatting that a lot of parents out there might have questions about how to encourage their daughters in STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. And because she's got a PhD in chemistry, which is a STEM field, I ask her for some advice for those who are raising daughters and might want to empower and encourage them in that STEM arena. So stay tuned for that. I think you're going to get a lot out of this conversation, and I'm really interested to hear what you all think about it. So without further ado, Dr. Samantha Radford. Welcome, Samantha. I am so happy to have you here on the Heartful Parent Podcast.
Hi, Christy. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
You know, when you reached out, when we connected through a class that we were actually both taking, and when you emailed me and said, hey, we should talk about being on one another's podcast, I was super excited because there aren't very many people out there talking about chemicals and toxicity with our kids. And I love that this is your focus. So can you share just a little bit about how you got interested in this? Kind of, I read your bio, but talk a little bit about why this, how did you land here?
Yeah, it's interesting. You know how it feels like things just worked out, even though you didn't have any plan at the time, that's kind of how it was. So, I majored in chemistry in college. A professor mentioned that, if you're doing hard sciences like chemistry or physics or things like that, they actually pay you a stipend to go to graduate school instead of you having to pay them. So I was like, okay, I'll go to grad school. And so I did that. And I ended up focusing on exposure science. And the idea with exposure science is like what all chemicals are out there, in the environment and in your home, which of course is part of your environment. And how do those chemicals affect you? And at the time, so I'm an only child. At the time, I had no interest in children. Like, when you're late teens, early 20s, people just assume that you want to hold babies because they're cute. Like people would try to hand me babies and I'd be like, what do I do with this? And it would start crying. And I was not familiar with children. I wasn't like a huge fan of them. But the thing is, and we'll get into this more later, I'm sure, these pesticides and things that I focused on tend to have the biggest impact on children. So a lot of what I focused on, I looked at pesticides in fruit juice, which, kids maybe not as much now because we tell people, it's too much sugar, but kids like fruit juice if they can get a hold of it. Or baby foods or things like that. And so I would spend a lot of time thinking about, how children were exposed to pesticides. And then by extension, how moms are exposed to chemicals. And then, once a mother becomes pregnant or, breastfeeding or whatever, how that would affect them. So I was also looking at, young women being exposed to chemicals because, of course, as they're pregnant or as they're breastfeeding, those chemicals, can be passed on to their child. But again, it was all just like very academic, like, oh, that's neat. It didn't really matter so much to me. And then pretty soon after I graduated with my PhD, I started teaching at the college level, and then I was pregnant. And all of a sudden, like, oh man, this really matters. Like these chemicals that like I've thought about, in reading about them and doing research on them, like in the lab. Now this is actually something that can impact this child that's, inside me. And then later that I'm nursing. And so it just naturally progressed. My oldest daughter was born. I fell in love with nursing her. There's a big component about breastfeeding in the work that I do online now. I loved having her so much. I fell in love. Like I can remember falling in love with her and feeling that just like wash over me. And then I loved having her, and I ended up having 3 more.
Oh, goodness.
So
that's quite a shift from the person who was like, I don't really like babies. I don't know what to do with them.
Yeah. It is. It's incredible. So now there's 4 of them. So my oldest one just turned 10 last week. My youngest one is 3.5. So it's been great. With all that said, as I was teaching chemistry, I wanted to be able to help people, outside of the classroom, and to help moms like who are actually in it and looking at products, what should I get in my home? What should I avoid? So I started my site, Evidence-Based Mommy, from there to be able to help them.
I love it. And, I've looked through your site, and you talk about a whole bunch of different places that chemicals can come in and affect our kids, many of which I'm just imagining that many folks out there are like me, like, I think I'm fairly aware. And then there were things on your site that I thought, wow, I've never even thought about that. Like mattresses, for example. Now, I remember thinking about it actually with a crib mattress, but, not after that. So can you maybe lay out for us, what are the big categories of places? You've mentioned food, and obviously there's many other places that we get exposed to chemicals. So are there sort of big categories that, from a bird's eye view, parents should be aware of, or at least have some knowledge about where kids can get exposed to things that really could harm them?
Yeah. And, you mentioned mattresses, for example. I want to kind of start with this caveat of I struggle with what to choose to talk about, because on one hand, like it's helpful for people to have this information, but on the other hand, maybe you can't afford like a top of the line mattress, or maybe like the best you can do is this hand me down. So I don't want to stress parents, who aren't in a position to get all these super crunchy organic products, so I want you to be able to kind of start where you are with what you have. So
I just want to say, I so appreciate that, because being able to worry about some of this stuff really comes from a place of privilege.
It's a privilege.
For sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And with that said, stress, you could consider stress a kind of harmful exposure too, right? So that produces cortisol in your body, and your kids feed off of your stress. So with all this, kind of do the best you can and then let it go as much as you can.
I love that. Do the best you can and let it go as best you can. That's great advice. It's probably great advice in many different areas of parenting.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Yes. So, but we'll just stick with the chemical thing. Maybe the biggest like foundational thing I would say first is if you are in an older home, so one that was built before 1978, but especially as homes get older, for example, when we first moved up here, I believe that the house that we were renting was built in like 1920. And even though, again, I have this PhD in exposure science, this wasn't something that I was thinking about. It just wasn't on my radar, because I don't feel like we had homes this old, like in the area of Georgia that I was in. before this, but we lived in this house. We had 2 dogs. We had a toddler, and then we had a baby who was just starting to crawl. And I was teaching a class called analytical chemistry, which is all about basically how to figure out how much of a particular chemical is in something, food, paint, dirt, like whatever, you name it. Like that's the job of analytical chemistry. And I knew we were in an older home, and I knew sometimes like, oh, lead paint chips. What would be fun is if I got some of like the paint chips off of our wall, or actually our windowsill, because we'd had a dog, and I hadn't connected this at the time, but we'd had a dog who one night she was stressed about something, and she chewed on the windowsill and like broke open to older layers of paint. And then it wasn't too long after that she started having like stomach upset and not acting right. And she ended up passing away. Goodness. But again, I hadn't put these things together. So I had my students, like I brought in some paint chips. There was another chemistry professor who lived in a house that was leased out by the same person, brought in some paint chips. And the amount of lead in that paint was just like, it was amazing, like not good amazing. It was terrifying, like in the percents, so it was like a quarter lead or something like that by weight. And I don't remember the exact number, but it was huge. And so it wasn't long after that we moved to a different place, a newer build. So if you're in an older home, and again, sometimes you can't move, and I totally get that. There are things you can do, to try to protect your family from lead. So first of all, it's usually door frames and windowsills that are most likely to have lead paint. Okay. As I mentioned, it was a window frame, that we got this from, but because the lead that they use, it's really good for making things like nice and opaque and a good white. Uh-huh. So that's why that's where it's going to be.
Okay. Yeah. Because those are usually the colors on those spaces in our homes.
Yeah.
Right? Okay.
Exactly. So if you've got that, make sure whatever you do, don't try to sand it off, because all that's going to do is put it all into the air, and you can breathe this, lead stuff into, and that's actually really, really bad. Like it'll cause, irreversible damage.
Interesting. I mean, I've always heard about ingesting it like orally. I'd never heard of inhaling it before.
Yeah. So what might happen is sometimes someone might realize like, oh my gosh, there's lead in my home, and they freak out and try to sand it all off. But now you've got all this like dust of lead, and you can absolutely cause problems with that. So instead, it is possible to have a professional do lead remediation and get rid of all that paint. But again, that's super expensive. So often the most affordable route that actually does pretty well is, the fancy word for it is encapsulation, but really it's just repainting over it. So get rid of any like big flakes, because lead paint tends to like make those big chips. Yep. So get rid of those. And then from there, just like paint back over, and that will, keep the lead tucked away in there.
Can I ask you a question as you're talking about that? So you talked about your dog chewing on the windowsill, and that ended up making him very ill. If there are just like lead paint chips, and let's imagine adults living in a home or kids who are not eating it, right? Not putting it in their mouths. Is that in and of itself a danger that should be remediated? Or is that not as big a deal if no one's eating it or breathing the dust?
That's a good question. So I mean, it's less of a big deal, but even so, that paint will degrade over time. And so it'll flake, we all have dust in our homes. So actually that's one of the next recommendations I was going to say, is that, in our spare time that we all have, if you're in one of these older homes like that you think might have lead, like it's more important to make a point of dusting more frequently and vacuuming more frequently, like with a HEPA filter, to try to get that dust up. So one of the things that I know we kind of mentioned in passing, but we can definitely talk a lot more about, is that babies and children are not only more likely, like they shove all sorts of crap in their mouth. So of course they're more right. And especially if they're like at that age where they're pulling up to stand, because that's right where my little girl was. She was like 9 months or something. So that's just the perfect side, like to gnaw on like windowsills, Anyways, not only are they more likely to get this stuff in them because they shove everything in their mouth, they're like always low to the ground and all of that, but it has a bigger impact on them because it's, it's like a butterfly effect, like a little change here while their brain is still being wired and all these systems are still undergoing just, being put together is going to have much larger effects than what on us where, we're mostly everything's put together at this point.
Right. And when you say like big significant effects, like what kinds of things when it comes to lead paint or lead in other, paint isn't the only place that lead can exist, I guess, but like what kind of impact on, on babies and children are we talking about?
It depends on how much, but lead is one of those few things that the CDC has said there is no safe exposure level for. And a lot of this is stuff that some of it you might see right now. Some of it might be, when they're 30, 40, 50, there's more likely to be behavioral problems, behavioral difficulties, IQ, it can lower IQ. And then with that said, if you're having behavioral difficulties in school, of course, you'll have, a harder time like getting a good education. And what, just looks like difficult behavior when people are children can turn into like criminal behavior, like violent criminal behavior as adults. So again, it's kind of a whole systemic racial thing because you've got people who have lower income in this kind of housing, but then on top of it, like they're getting put in situations that will still make you more likely to have low income. Yeah. So it
becomes a real equity issue.
Oh, it absolutely is. It's huge beyond like the mental health stuff, which is absolutely a possibility. There's high blood pressure that I don't remember, but it affects like lots of different body systems, like all sorts of different organs.
And of course, you already told the story of, how ill it made your dog. And, if it can make a dog that sick, it can certainly make a 9-month-old
it killed her.
That sick. So okay. So lead in old homes and some of the risks that come with those older homes is a big category. What else are we talking about in terms of big categories of exposure?
Oh, yeah. We can talk some about food too, because that's one of those things that like you can either, you could buy everything all organic and spend $1 bajillion on your groceries, which, nowadays, of course, you're spending $1 bajillion regardless, because like grocery bill has definitely gone up. But there's ways to, reduce the amount of pesticide that you're exposed to and it not have to be so expensive. So one of the easiest things to be aware of is that there's something called the Environmental Working Group, and they put out a list every year, something called the Dirty Dozen. So the Dirty Dozen are 12 different types of produce that have the most pesticide in them, and they update that list each year. And like spinach is always at the top of the list. Strawberries is at the top of the list. I don't remember everything off the top of my head, but I do remember those two. I think like kale. But if you just Google Dirty Dozen, you'll find it really easily. And those are the things that if you're going to buy something organic, but you don't want to like spend all your money in organic groceries, those are the things you buy organic. So get organic spinach, like swing for the organic strawberries. But the Environmental Working Group also has another list called the Clean 15. So it's the other end of the spectrum, the things that are least likely to have pesticide residues. So like onions are on those. So, don't kill yourself trying to buy like organic onions. And break the bank.
I've heard, and I don't know if this is accurate, but that some things that have like thicker skins, like avocado, bananas, those kinds of things are less likely to have harmful chemicals just because we don't eat the skin on them, right? We take that off. At least I hope people are taking it off.
Yeah. But, at the same time, that makes it harder for something like potatoes, because that's also where like all the minerals and the fiber is. Right. So it's like, do I keep the minerals and the fibers and also keep the pesticides, or do I get rid of them? Like,
yeah.
Yeah, there's always caveats.
Okay. So as we were talking, I just looked it up on the internet because I thought this will be interesting to see. And it looks like as of right now, strawberries is number 1, spinach number 2, kale number 3. So those are the ones you mentioned. Yeah, I know. Nicely done.
I did it.
And then it's got peaches, pears, nectarines, apples, grapes, bell and hot peppers, cherries, blueberries, and green beans. Green beans is an interesting one.
Yeah, it is. Well, I mean, I guess you do eat the whole thing, but a lot of these are really sweet, right? Because bugs like sugar just like we like sugar. So those are the things that tend to need more pesticides to grow them.
I hadn't even thought about it from that standpoint, that everybody's going for the sugar.
Exactly.
And interestingly, like a lot of these things, at least like apples and grapes, are the source of fruit juice that many kids drink.
Yes, that's exactly it. And a lot of times it's concentrated down. And even now, a lot of times if you see products that say no added sugar, but they also don't have like artificial sugars, what they'll do is they'll use like apple juice concentrate to sweeten things. So
because that doesn't qualify as sugar under the FDA.
Right.
Yep. Okay. Interesting.
Which means perhaps they're concentrating pesticide residues.
Interesting. Okay. So for those, again, we're talking about this, toxins that are in food. And as you said, you can spend $1 bajillion and get everything organic, but that is another place where you're coming from a place of privilege if you're able to do that. And I think, frankly, in our country, there are a lot of families who don't ever get fresh produce. That's, just beyond their budget, what they're able to get with assistance. But if possible, what I hear you saying is that at least looking at these, dirty dozen, these really highly, these types of foods where it could be really highly concentrated, that's a good first place to start.
Yeah. And even if, fresh produce isn't usually in the budget, when you get it in season, it tends to be cheaper and you tend to have lower pesticide residues because it's basically not as hard. You're not having to fight stuff off as much. So that might be one way to be able to get to fresh produce is get it when it's in season. Plus, there's nothing like, tomato that off the vine. Right. At
tomatoes in December are not anything to write home about.
No.
Okay. So this actually raises a question for me because I know when things aren't in season, strawberries, for example, a lot of families might get those frozen, right? Like a frozen bag of strawberries.
Yeah, get frozen. That's great.
Is there anything, I don't know, maybe this is a dumb question, but I don't have the PhD in chemistry. Is there anything about the freezing process that can diminish or decrease the danger of the pesticides or the toxins in food? Or is that they're just preserving it in the same way that it's preserving the food?
I mean, maybe a little, probably not a lot, but the big thing with that also is they're going to be getting it in season whenever they freeze it. So it's going to be stuff that was grown with less pesticide, hopefully, anyways.
Okay.
But yeah, getting frozen produce is a great way to get produce on a budget, and still get the nutrition that you need. Canned can work too, as long as it doesn't have a ton of salt. Right. So yeah, those are all ways.
So we've got our homes, which focusing on those older homes, we've got our foods. Are there other spaces for those families who might be able to look a little bit deeper that we should be looking at? And one thing that's coming up for me a lot right now, because it's summer, is sunscreen, which I'm lathering my kids up with. And, we try to use like zinc-based sunscreen. But we were recently on a trip in Mexico. We forgot our sunscreen and the options were very limited. So talk to me a little bit about sunscreen.
Yeah, actually I just did a podcast episode all about sunscreens and I have an article on
I love that. We will link to that podcast episode in the show notes for this.
Yay.
So that people can check that out. But give us the Cliff's Notes.
Sure. Okay. So you mentioned using zinc. This is good. There are two major categories of like the chemicals that they use in sunscreens. There's what they call physical sunscreens or mineral sunscreens. And then there's what they call chemical or organic sunscreens. And that's kind of confusing because you're thinking like organic food is good, right? But organic sunscreen means like an organic chemical. So it's not good in this case. So anyways, the mineral sunscreens are either like the zinc oxide that you mentioned or titanium dioxide. That's pretty much the two. And the way that works is basically the tiny, tiny particles of zinc oxide or titanium dioxide act like tiny mirrors on your skin. So if you've ever noticed that you put on sunscreen, and I'm already pretty pale, so I look like exceptionally pale.
Yeah, it turns
like
you white.
Yes, just like a beam of whiteness. That's because it's doing its job and it's reflecting the sun away from your skin. So that is what is safer. The chemical sunscreens, a lot of them start with oxy or something like that. And those work by actually, like, whenever the sun's energy hits them, it degrades the little molecule. And so that way it's doing that to the sunscreen instead of to your skin, which is good. But also those can get into your body. They can get to, if you're pregnant, they can get to the fetus. They can only by a few days, but they can have an effect on like how long, like gestation and that kind of thing. They've definitely shown that it can have effects on children.
Okay.
And the environment. A lot of those are really bad for coral reefs, which is a huge problem that we won't even get into.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, I think a lot of sunscreens now are declaring that they are reef safe. And it's those zinc oxide and titanium dioxide ones. And in fact, when we were on our trip, everyone was told, please only bring reef safe sunscreen. Now, I don't know if people actually paid it. It's not like they were checking your sunscreen at the door, but it was at least a recommendation to try to do that. So yeah, that's an interesting point though. And you're right. We could probably dig in for hours into what it's doing to coral reefs. But, as a side note, just recognizing that this isn't just harming our own bodies, but the planet in a much more dramatic way than these other products.
Yes. Yeah. A lot of this stuff that we're talking about has effects on, the whole earth, not just, I just tend to focus on human exposure. That's where my expertise is, but absolutely.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Okay. So homes, food, sunscreens. If you could say to a parent who has, you've got 4 children under the age of 10. So let's focus on kind of that age range, anywhere from a breastfeeding baby or bottle fed baby all the way up to, end of elementary school. Are there any other sort of top risks that if you could wave a magic wand and have everyone have enough resources to change, would there be anything else on that list that you would want to change for those kids?
The other big thing I would focus on, you mentioned at the beginning, would be mattresses. So crib mattresses, and then, as they get older, their mattress. So first of all, with babies, you mentioned tiny babies, they sleep, like 12 to newborns can sleep even 20 hours a day. And a lot of that time will be on their mattress. And the other thing you think about, whenever you or your baby or whoever is laying on the mattress, obviously, like, your head is right above the mattress and the pillow. This goes for the pillow too. And your breathing space is just right there. So any chemicals that are volatilizing up out of that mattress or out of that pillow is like right there in your breathing space. So you're getting a good concentrated dose of that. And there can be lots of different chemicals. A lot of them would be flame retardants, would probably be the biggest thing. So most mattresses, including like memory foam, are made with polyurethane foam, which does a great job as far as being nice and cozy and cushiony. But the problem is that they're very flammable, and you don't want people sleeping on something super flammable. So they put flame retardants in them, to avoid that. But then now we're finding out these flame retardants have lots of different health effects that are far reaching and long lasting, and all sorts of stuff. So if you could swing for an organic mattress, that would be amazing. If not, so if you look at the tag, so like I have 2 chairs over there that are upholstered. If you looked at the bottom of that, there would be a tag and it would say that it's for California Prop 65, which is basically, even though like I'm all the way on the East Coast, a lot of what California does, the rest of the nation, as far as this kind of regulation stuff follows. And this tag would have some stuff, and it would have 2 things that it either says, this product is treated with chemical flame retardants, or this product is not treated with chemical flame retardants. And it would have to have an X by one of those things. So if you could find something that is not treated with flame retardants, that would be great. And I think it might be like 2012, 2013, but I'm not sure yet, that California started requiring that. So if you have something that's older that doesn't have that tag, it probably has flame retardants, So if you can get something newer than that where it says.
Well, and it strikes me, as I said, when we bought a crib mattress, and I believe we used the same crib mattress for both of my girls, we did get an organic crib mattress. And then I never thought about it again. And because, we bought the mattresses for their beds, my husband and I have a Sleep Numbers bed that we've had because those last longer. So we've had that for our entire marriage, like 17 years. And I'm thinking, it never even occurred to me to think about the chemicals in that bed, but we are going to need a new bed in the next couple of years. Sooner, if you ask me, later, if you ask my husband, because they're not cheap, right? They're very expensive. But at some point, right, we're going to need another one. And I'm thinking, well, maybe this is something we should think about for us too.
Yeah. And again, it's one of those things where it matters more for younger children than it does for us. But I mean, it still matters, so it's just kind of like, how much is it worth it to you? You know what I mean? And how much do you have the possibility to do that? So a lot of times, if you just go into like a mattress store, in most places, like especially more rural places, they probably won't have like the really nice organic mattress. Like they just won't carry them. You can get one with what they call CertaPure foam. So that's basically a polyurethane that they're saying definitely doesn't have flame retardants. But that particular certification only covers like the foam in it. So if there's like a vinyl cover on top of that, like it kind of doesn't matter because the vinyl's got all sorts of stuff that'll off gas.
Excellent. Okay. So, I mean, at least this is food for thought for folks. And I think just being aware that there really are a lot of chemicals in all the products that we bring into our homes, or in most of them that we bring into our homes, that, can have an impact, especially collectively, right? When you build it all together, that thinking about some of these bigger categories, as you said, the home, the actual structure of the home that we're living in, the food that we're putting in our bodies, the things that we're spreading on our bodies, like the sunscreen, and then the place that we're sleeping. Those are some really good places to start. And I want to sort of take listeners back to what you said at the beginning of this conversation, which is you do the best you can, and then you let the rest go, because the stress and anxiety and panic from all of this isn't healthy either.
Right. That's actually exactly where I was going. So I'm glad you said it.
Yeah. Samantha, I want to ask you another question that I'm going to confess is unrelated to the toxicity.
Okay.
But as we're talking, and I'm, speaking with someone who's clearly, passionate about the work that you do, you are a woman in STEM, right? You're a woman that went and got your PhD in a profession, in a subject that is still predominantly male dominated. And I have a daughter that is interested in science. And I know there are many other listeners out there who really want to foster that idea for those who are raising daughters, who really want to foster the idea in their girls that they can do, any of these professions, including chemistry, biology, mathematics, and those STEM types of professions. Do you have any advice for parents who are raising girls to help encourage and empower them to follow their dreams or dive into those STEM fields when they probably get a lot of messaging that they don't belong there?
It's interesting. So I actually am a first generation college graduate. So, I mean, I didn't, I came from like my dad would work third shift at the carpet mill and that kind of thing, which, speaking of chemicals, but I mean, they just encouraged me in were like, yeah, I go to this college, and yeah, grad school sounds great. And I really appreciate that. One of the things I would say is don't express like being afraid of math, even if you are. Like, it's just another subject. I remember, I think at the beginning of the school year last year, we were meeting teachers and we walked by and we met the art teacher, and she said something about like, oh no, I wouldn't want to teach math. And I'm like, dude, like it's math for up to 12-year-olds. Like, and it's just not necessary.
Yeah.
Like, just, it's another subject, so don't treat it like don't give it that stigma, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
As the parent, you mean, or as the adult. Yeah.
Yeah. So it can be fun too. And then, I don't know. I mean, I guess just like give them those opportunities, if that's something that they're interested in, and kind of find out what's around you. People host science camps and all of that. That can be a lot of fun. But yeah, absolutely. You do meet with that. So actually, when I was teaching, I had gotten a grant to get some instrumentation at the university I was working at. And there was like a dinner, to give out these grants. And frankly, it was mostly a bunch of old white men there. Like, that's just, who were part of this group. And I took my husband with me, because we're like, we get to go out to a nice dinner without the kids for once. And multiple times someone would stop us and they would talk to him and ask him, oh, what did you get the grant for? And he's like, actually, it was her. And they're like, oh, so you got one of the high school teacher grants.
Oh, wow.
Which, God bless high school teachers. Like, they're great. But, the assumption was it certainly couldn't have been like the professor thing. Cause
so interesting. The assumption that it was the man, and that if it was you, it had to be at a lower level of education. Yeah.
Yes. So yeah, it
totally exists. And, I used to be in the law profession, and it exists there too. Despite the fact that there are more women in law school graduating at this point than there are men, it's still very much, in many ways, a good old boys club, that the people at the top are still the men. So I really appreciate the advice that you said, though, to not stigmatize math, because I have tried to not do that as a parent, because I didn't hate math. Okay. I didn't love it at the college level, but I didn't mind it before that. And I did fine at it, but it's not my passion. And my husband loves math. Like, he's a computer programmer who will like pick up a math textbook and get excited and think it's fun. And he's like desperate to help my daughter with her homework. I know, I'm like, he's a big weirdo. I love him dearly, but we're a little different in that way. And so my daughter has definitely heard this messaging that like, well, if you've got questions about your math homework, go to your dad, right? Mm-hmm. Because he is more gifted at it.
Yeah, he's the individual with the expertise.
But it definitely, I think, has created some messaging for her around her own skill in math, and something that I'm working real hard with her to reverse. But I appreciate that advice. Samantha, there are so many other things that we could talk about, women in STEM, toxic chemicals, breastfeeding. We might have to have you back to talk more at some point.
I know. I'm like, let's talk about everything, but
we can save it. We can save
later.
But in the meantime, for those parents who are interested in learning more about your work, what is the best place for people to track you down?
So my website is Evidence Based Mommy. I'll make sure to definitely give you the link to that. We very briefly touched on breastfeeding. One of the biggest things that I like doing is supporting and celebrating people who are nursing past the first year, because I feel like the support kind of drops off at that point. So I host an event every year called Breastfeeding Beyond Babyhood. That won't be till April next year, but I can keep you in the loop for that. So, and I've got a podcast too, which, you already said you'll link to a particular episode.
I will.
Yeah.
You also have a fabulous download that people can get. Tell us what it's called, and we'll put the link in the show notes for people.
Yeah. So it's called 11 Simple Swaps for a Healthier Home. So some of the stuff we've already covered, but actually I'm looking at this list and I'm like, oh man, I didn't tell them about XYZ. So there's things about food. There's things about cleaners, which we didn't even touch, personal hygiene products like shampoo, conditioner, like all of it. just brief ideas for ways that you can avoid some of those like big categories.
Fantastic. I have no doubt that listeners are going to want to get their hands on that. So we will definitely drop the link to that in the show notes, along with your website and your podcast. Samantha, thank you for the work that you are doing in the world, and from going from a woman who wanted nothing to do with babies to a woman with 4 of them trying to keep babies around the world safe, babies and kids and all of us. I'm so grateful for the work you're doing. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Heartful Parent Podcast folks out there. I'm so grateful to you for joining me on another week of the podcast. We are trucking along as we head into the fall, sort of wrapping up summer here. And I'm thrilled that you joined me for this conversation with Dr. Radford. I hope that you got a lot out of it. I know that I did. Sort of opened my eyes to thinking about a few things that I hadn't been thinking about before. And I hope that it did that for you as well. If I can ever support you in the Heartful Parent Academy or through private coaching, I work with parents in many, many different ways. Please reach out. Let's have a conversation about how I might be able to support you. In the meantime, have a great week, and I'll see you next week on the Heartful Parent Podcast. Cheers.